Every year, I get several inquiries about properties that would possibly sell as a rent-to-own. For many of these buyers, they're looking for a more personal connection than they might get from a big mortgage company. Or perhaps they can't qualify for a typical mortgage because either their credit score isn't the best or some of their income is maybe under the table. In a quest for the perfect financing option, though, many of those who are searching for rent to own are looking specifically for a perfect option where 100% of every rent check goes toward owning the rental home. Ideally, they would rent for a few years, the landlord would sign over the lease once the home is paid off, and that would be it. Wouldn't that be amazing? Unfortunately, here's the bad news. It can't work that way. When you start looking at the logistics, it's not as perfect as it looks at first glance. Let me show you what I mean. Say for a moment that you are the landlord property owner. You own a house and you want to rent it out for extra income. You have two sets of tenants to choose from, regular tenants and rent-to-own tenants. Which would you choose? If you choose the regular tenants, the property will continue to be an investment for the rest of your life, and you could pass it on to your children. If you choose the rent-to-own tenants, you will give the home away in a few years. You collect no interest, you make virtually no profit, and then you have to come up with the money yourself to buy a new investment property. From a landlord's point of view, it's not a good business move. Now let's look at this model of rent-to-own from the tenant's perspective. Assuming a tenant could find an owner who would give the property to them at the end of the lease, consider how long that lease would have to be to make up for the value of the house. A minimum of 15 to 30 years. That would be 15 to 30 years in the same house without moving. And it's not like a mortgage where you build equity. It's technically a rental until the very end. The deed of the home would remain in the name of the landlord until the end. So the landlord has control over the lease until that last check is paid. So in this hypothetical situation, if the tenants move before it's paid off, they lose it all. Finally, let's put those two things together. You have a tenant who loses the house if they move, and a landlord who loses the house if the tenants stay until the end. Imagine the friction. It would be like a round of Survivor with several $100,000 house on the line. Ultimately, this particular model would make a miserable situation for both parties. That is why rent-to-own contracts are virtually always used as a short-term solution only. Let's take a look at the two rent-to-own models that are most commonly in use in the real estate world today, lease option and lease purchase. In lease option, the tenant purchases the option to buy the home when the lease is up. This is generally arranged at the start of the lease and is a percentage of the home's value. So when you pay your first and last month's rent, your security deposits, your option to buy would be like another deposit. The option to purchase is generally non-refundable and does not go toward the purchase of the home in any way. In lease purchase, the tenants pay additional money each month, above and beyond the rent, that will go toward the home's down payment. Ideally, by the time the lease is up, the tenants will have paid enough extra of those funds that it will cover the down payment on the mortgage. This extra $200, $400 or more, depending on the value of the house, is non-refundable if the tenants do not or cannot buy the home at the end of the lease. The lease term is generally 1 to 3 years, and the buyer is expected to purchase the home using a traditional mortgage when the lease is up. Because every rent-to-own deal is custom to the specific landowner and the tenant, sometimes the terms can be a combination of both models or a little different altogether. So obviously there are some risks here. In short, if you are unable to get a mortgage or purchase the home for any reason, you lose all of the money that you have invested. And that's a lot of pressure. What if life takes an unexpected turn and it impacts your credit? Or what if the market changes 2 years down the road and homes are more affordable and you find one that you like better? Both options also leave room for potential fraud, particularly against the tenants. Always be wary of any seller or landlord who refuses to allow a neutral third party, like an attorney or a long-term escrow company, to manage the funds and the records. It's just too easy for the seller to lose the payment records. Or consider this: what if the seller, God forbid, dies in a car accident and his heirs don't want to honor the contract? What are your options? Go to court in a lengthy process? You're just stuck between a rock and a hard place. You will also want to involve a title company to ensure that the person you are dealing with is not a scammer and they actually own the property. Some of these scammers are incredibly convincing. I also suggest having your attorney review the contract before you sign. The deck will already be stacked in the landlord's favor. You want to be positive that the landlord is not leaving loopholes that would allow him to take advantage of the situation later down the road. So for rent to own, you have two options. You've got the lease option and lease purchase. The lease option, where you put the deposit down and it gives you the option to potentially buy the house at the end of the lease. Or you've got the lease purchase, where you add money onto your payment each month that goes toward your down payment. But again, it's non-refundable if for some reason you have to walk away from the lease. One of the things that I recommend, I almost always advise my buyers, is to look at other options before committing to rent to own. Options that will get the deed of the house into your name as quickly as possible and take control out of the seller's hands and put it in your own. Finally, let's take a look at how rent-to-own contracts stack up against the other loan types, traditional mortgages and seller carry. Of the three types, rent-to-own is the one loan type that strongly favors the interests of the sellers, even though the sellers aren't getting much out of it. It also has the highest risk for the buyer, and for the terms and term length, rent-to-own has shorter terms, higher interest rates, and more restrictions. Because of the risk to buyers, rent-to-own contracts are only used in rare situations. Instead, seller carry is a much better option that at least gives the buyer some control. If you have questions about what loan type would work best for you, please call, text, or email. I look forward to answering your questions.